right. Hello, welcome to the All Things Angular webinar with Cypress. My name is Emily. I am the Community Events Manager at Cypress, and we are very excited to have you all here right now. We are simulcasting to YouTube. We are recording this session, so you will have access to this in many ways later. We are really excited to welcome you to this session. Today, I have two absolutely fabulous DX engineers from Cypress, Jordan and Eli. I will let them introduce themselves here soon. Just a couple housekeeping top. Feel free in the chat to go ahead and say hi, share where you're from. As soon as I finish this little intro, I will go and open up our Q&A. Please go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A there, and then we should have time near the end to be able to answer those questions. I will also note that this is really focused on the specific Angular community and the Angular component testing and Protractor migration features that we do have. Questions outside of kind of what falls into the Angular realm, you can post those. I can't guarantee that we'll be able to get to those today. You can always join us on Discord or reach out to our team if you'd like to be able to get some of those other questions answered. So I think that's all that I had to share. I will pass it over again to the absolutely fabulous, wonderful, top-notch, all-star, amazing speakers, Jordan and Eli, to take it from here. Thanks all. Talk to you soon.
That was awesome. Thank you, Emily. Well, welcome everybody. I'd like to just say thank you again for joining us today and sharing with us of some of the really exciting stuff that we have coming for Angular developers. We'll go ahead and kick it off. If I can get focused, there we go. All right, this is our agenda today. We got part one is going to be our introduction. And then we're gonna show off a couple of new things. We're gonna have migrating to Cypress from Protractor. And doing a demo around that. And then we're also going to be showing component testing with Cypress. So my name is Eli Lucas, and I'm a developer experience engineer here at Cypress. And I am joined by my colleague,
Jordan Powell, also a DX engineer.
Awesome. All right, Jordan, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So we're going to... this talk is going to be very centric around, it's going to be mostly focused around a demo. So we're going to demo some of these things for you. But before we kind of do the demo, I think it's important we just talk a little bit high level. So we'll talk a little bit, you can go to the next slide, Eli. We're going to talk a little bit high level about some of this thing. So first of all, Cypress now has, as of 10.0, which came out in June of this year, we now have first class support for two different types of testing. Obviously, end-to-end has been the bread and butter of Cypress since the beginning of Cypress, but we now added support for component testing, which we'll talk and show you how to do later at the end of this. The next slide. So some of the three key features that we wanted to highlight in this talk is three features that myself, Eli, and others on our team have really focused over the last year here at Cypress on implementing. And why we did that is because myself, coming from the Angular community for I've been there since Angular 2, so the last 6 years, something like that. I really felt like I've noticed there was a big gap between the Angular and Cypress communities, and I really wanted, we at Cypress really wanted to, draw them closer, and we wanted to create tools that would help make the experience using Cypress for Angular users. As we're going to talk about our Cypress schematic, which probably a lot of you have used and maybe not even noticed before. We have a new app that we just released called the Cypress Migrator, which we'll do a brief demo of, and then the crux or the big portion of the talk is going to be around the component testing in Angular, which again is pretty exciting new feature that we released, and something you guys have been asking me and our team here at Cypress for quite a while. Next slide, Eli. All right, so here we're going to talk about how you migrate to Cypress from Protractor. And the reason, and some of the tools we're going to show is going to be the Cypress Migrator app, which we talked about. We'll show you how to use this, and I think you guys will be, it's a pretty cool tool that we built that will help. Basically, it's a code shift or code mod. So basically you put in Protractor code and it spits out the matching Cypress code. So for those of you who are, either in the process of switching from Protractor to Cypress, or maybe even considering like, what do we do since Protractor is deprecated in version 16? What do we want to do? I know that there's going to be a fork of Protractor that is going to be continue to live on, but for any of those people that want to make the switch, this is one of the tools that we built to help with that. Next slide. So this is one of the reasons why we say you should migrate, is this friendly little error. So any of you who have run Protractor, for whatever reason, I don't even know why you get it, but sometimes you just get this error and you run the same command again and it works. So this is one reason, but it really kind of, in my opinion, sort of encapsulates why, like, the overall experience of using Cypress for me as an Angular developer was always significantly superior than when my experience using Protractor. And so, yeah, there's plenty of reasons why I think, but you can continue, Eli. All right, so now let's do a demo, Eli, of like what it actually looks like, because it's easy to say, hey, we have this cool tool, but like it's different when you actually like have an application, right? So,
yep. All right, let me introduce you guys to this little app that we have going on right now. And if you've ever done the quintessential Angular tutorial, the Tour of Heroes, this is kind of a take on the Tour of Heroes. Got basically a list of heroes here, and the idea is that these are heroes looking for jobs. So this is kind of like Uber, but for superheroes, right? So you're looking to hire somebody, you come to the site. You can give them a thumbs up, but you have to be logged in to do it. And so this app features authentication as well. And so we'll log in as a user, test.com. Test 1, 2, 3 is the password. And now we can come in here and we can, give our favorite heroes some likes, and we can hire them if we want. And you can see right now we got a bunch of just test data going on here. Everybody's fly girl, but that's all right. But this is the app that we're going to be testing today. And so like when we got this app, somebody started on writing some Protractor tests for it. So let's fire up the Protractor test here real quick and just see what we got going on. So over here, I already got the app running over here, and I'm going to run ng e2e to fire up Protractor. And every once in a while I'll get that error, but if I do it again, it starts back up for me, and we can see, a bunch of stuff happened, I suppose, but at least I got some indications here that my test pass. But that does kind of, personally, it kind of leaves a lot to be desired as far as like a test runner and tool goes. So let's go ahead and take a crack at migrating this small test suite that we have so far here over to Cypress. A good way to get started with Cypress is to use the Cypress schematic. And so we'll go ahead and install that using the ng add at cypress/schematic. Let it run. Find it. It's going to ask us if we want to proceed. We're going to say yes. And we're going to be asked a couple of different questions here. And would we like to make the default ng e2e command use Cypress? We're going to go ahead and say yes. Now, the nice thing about this new version of the schematic is that it leaves all of your Protractor stuff in place. So you don't have to worry about losing any of that other stuff and having to like revert your branch or anything like that. It's all going to be there for you. Okay, now that we have Cypress installed, let's go ahead and run an npm script called npm cypress open, which the schematic's added for us. And this is going to pop up the new Cypress 10.0. If you haven't seen 10.0 yet, it's a brand new gorgeous UI that we got going on here. And right when you launch it up, you get to take your choice of what type of testing you want to do. Since we're doing Protractor testing, it's end-to-end testing. I'm going to go ahead and go into here. This is going to pop up and list all of the compatible browsers that you have installed on your operating system. I'm going to go ahead and launch it inside of Chrome. And we'll pop up and I'll hit the spec.sci.ts, which is the default file that gets scaffolded. And you can see here that this default test, it's hitting our local server, but it's looking for some text that doesn't belong, that's not in this hero app right now. So that's why we're getting it to fail, but we're going to fix that. Open up the site here in Visual Studio Code. And if we go and take a look at the Protractor test, you can see, so here's the Protractor test that we ran earlier. I'm going to take this and use our Cypress migrator tool and get it converted over to a Cypress test. And so to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and copy the test itself. You don't need to grab any of the requires or anything like that unless there are other types of stuff besides Protractor, but we're not going to need those. So I'll copy those over and pull up the migrator tool and over here. This is what it kind of looks like when it pops up. We got a little sample test here. What you do is you put your Protractor code here on the left, hit migrate to Cypress, and it's going to output some Cypress code here on the right. And so I'll take that out, paste in our current test, hit migrate to Cypress. And you can see here that we went through and pretty much replaced the Protractor APIs with the equivalent Cypress APIs. So instead of browser.get, we have site.visit, and then so on as we go down. Now, another nice thing that the tool does for you is down below here, it talks about all the commands that were used in this particular migration. And so if you're not quite familiar with the tool, or I'm sorry, with Cypress, you can click on these and get taken straight to the docs where you can get some more information. And that's kind of like another one of the reasons why we built this migration tool, is just like as an educational experience, especially for those coming from Protractor that may not be too familiar with Cypress. We want to make sure that we can help you get up to speed as quickly as possible. And so now that we got our Cypress code, I'm going to hit copy right here and go back into code, and I'll pull up the Cypress into end test and just replace what's here currently with the Cypress and go back to our test browser, and you can see everything works. So we had three, kind of simple tests in here, but we checked the title of the page. We checked to make sure that we could log in and that we displayed a list of heroes. Over here in the test runner, if you click on this, you can come in here and see like each individual step that Cypress took to get to that particular stage. And so this one right here, the can login, it's probably a little bit more, but you can see we visited the site. We got the login button, and you can see that login button in the top right-hand corner is a little bit highlighted because that's the element that it found when we ran this selector. We clicked on it, and so you can see the little red dot, and then it pops up in the modal. We find the email and password text boxes, and we type our username and password into them. We find the sign in button and we click it. And then we just make sure that we verify that we log in by seeing that we actually have a log out button. So that's the like real quick 5-minute demo of the Cypress Protractor migration tool.
Yeah, and the important thing to note there, and Eli hinted at it, is that Protractor and Cypress fundamentally are pretty different languages. So there are things that obviously translate one-to-one, but a lot of times patterns you'll see with Protractor, like page objects, things like that, where you have abstractions on top of just the Protractor commands themselves, aren't going to translate because it's not like it's just a code model where it takes what you pass it and it gives you at the end. So again, that's why we build it as an educational tool. So as you'll use it, you'll see some things maybe don't translate one-to-one, or maybe there's a different way to write the same type of test in Cypress, something like that. But again, just highlight that it's an educational tool, and we hope that you guys will find it useful in helping to learn Cypress. So.
Yep. And to go even more in depth, we have a protractor migration guide that you can find here at the site. And this goes deep into all the stuff protractor and the equivalents in Cypress and how to get you up and running in it. So if you are looking at doing a protractor migration tool, check our protractor migration, check out the migration tool, and check out our migration guide. It'll help you along your way. All right, what do we got next, Jordan?
All right, well, now we got the thing that everyone cares the most about, it seems like, which is component testing with Cypress. And I guess before we get into component testing, like into the nitty gritty, I think it's important to ask a few like why questions or like high level questions. And the first one being like, what is the difference between end-to-end and component testing? Because a lot of us are familiar with writing end-to-end tests, whether it be Protractor or Cypress or some other end-to-end testing platform, and maybe a lot of us have done integration testing or unit testing. But component testing is kind of like a new category of testing in a lot of ways. So it's kind of like a unit test. It's kind of like an integration test. So I think it's important we highlight a few of these. Next slide, Eli. So the way I like to look at component testing is like this. So in the past, we used to build websites based upon pages, right? We used to, as a developer, someone would come and would say, I need an about page and it needs these features. And then we would build our applications based upon pages. And that's how we built, applications for many, many years. But we quickly learned like over time, especially with the adoption of component driven development like frameworks like React and obviously Angular and Vue, those frameworks took a very component centric approach to development. And so as time has progressed, we really have shifted our focus from pages to components. And when we look at is instead of end-to-end testing, we think about testing in a lot of ways from a page level. And if you go to the next slide, component testing is in a lot of ways if taking that same page but looking at it in a much more granular, isolated way, where we're thinking not looking at the page as a whole, but all the individual components that page represents, and we want to test those parts in isolation by themselves. So that's one thing I like to point out. If you go to the next slide, one of the things that I really like about component testing is that it enforces component like test-driven development, which in a lot of ways it's like I think like the perfect use case for it, because the best case for component testing, in my opinion, is like when you're actually building the component. So like when you're building the component, you get the most value by introducing the test from the very beginning, because you can literally see the component in isolation in Cypress without like visiting some URL and like a page and clicking on some buttons to like get to the thing you actually care about. Where it's like Cypress, you just mount the component and you just can actually see it, and you can see the way styles affect it. You could see the way props affect it. Certain interactions by user interact it. So I think that that's one of the great benefits of it. And then in the end, after you've built your component, you then have working tests that you can then validate and assert moving forward. So, and this pattern really enforces the shift left mentality. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, but it's basically this idea of historically software was built from this notion of we would gather system requirements, then we would then turn those into software requirements. Then we would do some analysis. Then we would do program design, coding. And then after we did all those things, we would then introduce testing to make sure everything worked before it became operational, went to production. But the idea of like shifting left is essentially taking testing and moving it as far left as possible so that we begin to think about testing from the very beginning through every single step of this process. So it's like we begin to ask, how could we test each one of these steps is working as we progress through this diagram. Next slide. And so here's a quick diagram of like the difference between end-to-end and component testing. And important thing here is like, what's tested, end-to-end, all the apps versus individual components. I'm not going to read all of these, but a couple things is important to note that typically end-to-end tests are written by developers or QA teams because you don't have to have an intimate knowledge of how your application is architected or things like that. But component testing, you're actually working with the component and the framework directly. So some knowledge of, the component at the very least is necessary. So typically it's going to be written by developers or designers. Doesn't mean QA people couldn't write it. It's just that it's going to be maybe a little bit more of a learning curve. And then the other important thing to note here is the initialization. So what I mean by that is with end-to-end test, visiting the URL is the thing that basically kicks off or initializes the test, right? So when you visit a page, that basically is like the first step of your test. Where with component testing, we're not visiting pages. Remember, we're testing components. So instead of visiting, we're now mounting a component. Alrighty. Now let's do the demo, Eli.
All right, back over to the demo. Okay, so we're going to be writing some component tests for our Heroes app here. And as Jordan said, a lot of the times you want to introduce component testing as early as possible while you're designing, while you're building your components. And Cypress component testing is really a great development tool for that use case because you get to use the Cypress test runner to view your component and interact with your component, use all the debugging tools to get in there and inspect it and modify the CSS and all that kind of fun stuff. But we also know that you're going to have just tons of components out there that you've already created, and we need to write tests for that. So that's kind of what we're going to be showing today with the app. And so first, I think we'll probably start with something kind of small and easy to get up and running. And maybe we'll start with the button. How does that sound?
Yeah. Every app has a button, right, Eli?
Yeah. I mean, what can you do without a button? Okay, so let's we'll close that out. Oh, let me switch branches here real quick. Go close Cypress and close this out. And I think everything is good. I already have Cypress installed in this project. Let's go ahead and launch it up and see what it's like to set up component testing. So you can see we're back here. This time we're going to choose component testing. And one of the major differences between end-to-end testing and component testing is that we need some type of development server to be able to test your components into. And cool thing about Cypress is that we use the development server of your framework. So it's not like we're firing up our own development server or anything like that. And so in the case of Angular here, we're making sure that we're using Angular's development server and all the other things that come along with Angular as well. And so we'll click it. We see that we do inspection of your project to see what framework that you're using, and you can see that we detected that it's Angular. Cypress component testing also supports React and Vue and some of the meta frameworks that come with those, like Next and Next and so on. But we're talking about Angular here today, so I'm gonna hit Next. This short screen right here is just kind of giving you a little bit of a lowdown of the dependencies that you're going to need, and we do a check to make sure that they're all there. Everything's green here, so I'll go ahead and hit continue. And then this is giving you a rundown of all the modifications that we're going to make to your project right here. So we're going to be setting up a Cypress configuration file. We're going to be setting up the Cypress folder and all the files that come in the Cypress folder that if you use Cypress, you're probably familiar with a lot of them already. Our component index HTML that we actually mount your component into, and a fixtures example file if you're doing fixtures. And there we go. And so now we're back at a pretty familiar screen from the end-to-end section, but we'll say start component testing. And this is going to launch the browser. And you'll see initially we don't have any component tests in our project. So let's go ahead and create one. We're going to be testing the button component here. And so I'll use this little program to create a button component.sci.ts file. If you've used Cypress in the past, you might notice that we actually have a new file extension that we recommend that the projects look for off the bat. And that's because with component testing, we actually recommend that you co-locate your spec files with your code. And there's other testing frameworks that also do the same thing. So we wanted to make sure we had a unique pattern that when we're looking for our tests, that we would only pick up Cypress tests, and not pick up like Jest tests or Karma tests or anything like that that you might have out there. So I'll use a little snippet here to create a new spec, and we're going to do the button component. And this will be button, we'll import button.component. And this is what a basic component test looks like. We have our describe and our its, and for this particular test, we're just going to want to make sure that, hey, can we mount our component here? And we have the sci.mount command, and this was the major difference between end-to-end testing and component testing, is that with end-to-end testing, you initialize your test by visiting a page. Component testing, you initialize your test by mounting a component in isolation in the test runner. So there's none of the other stuff that comes along with it. This is just going to be the button component by itself. So let's go ahead and go back and see what that looks like. Okay, so you can see we have a button. It's missing something right now, and that's because in our button we actually pass in some content to be transcluded into the button itself, like the actual label for the button and whatnot, and we haven't passed that in yet. So let's go ahead and do that. There's a couple of different ways to do that, and I will copy this over here so you don't have to see me type a bunch. But one way to do it is to create a wrapper component and then mount that wrapper component. But inside of the wrapper component, you actually use your button component. And so here we got the app button, and then we got the text to click me, and we'll mount it. When we do this, we need to make sure that we provide the button component as a declaration, so Angular knows how to, tie this tag back into the component and all that jazz. And then we'll run a command here. So we'll sci.get the button. So this is a selector that gets the button. You might notice that you can be a little bit more free when you're writing component tests with your selectors, because you're not going to have a whole bunch of other things. Like, I know my button is only going to have one button in it, and so I can write a selector that says get my button. And then I'm just saying, hey, it should have the text to click me. And there we go. We've got a passing test, and you can see that we now actually have our label in here. But we realize this syntax is probably a little bit cumbersome. And so there is another way that you can actually do this, and that is using the Angular template syntax directly inside of the mount command. And this is what that looks like. So instead of passing in a component to the mount command, we pass in an Angular template with the button and click me. And so we completely got rid of the wrapper component in this case. We do still need to make sure that we pass in the button declaration, so it knows to tie this back and forth again. I'll show you a way to make this a little bit better here in a second, but I'm going to minimize that so I don't keep accidentally going to it. Here we go. Now we've got two tests. They're both basically doing the same thing, just different ways. Now, you might find yourself writing a bunch of tests where you're doing repetitive things like declaring these declarations. To get around that, you can actually customize your sci.mount command to do pretty much whatever you want. And to do that, what you're going to do is go over here into the support folder and open up the component.ts file. And here we have this custom command of mount. Well, I'm going to go ahead and replace that with one that automatically mount or automatically adds the button component into the declarations. And so this is the command that you actually run when you run sci.mount. And so we'll make sure that the button gets added into the declarations and that we mount the component using the actual Angular or Cypress Angular mount function. And now we can come over here, and since we're doing this in a central place, we don't need to do it all over. I'll go ahead and click save and go back. And there you go. Now the test is still running again. Now, in this particular application, all of our components are a part of this components module. And so instead of importing each individual component, I'm going to actually just import the module. And so we'll change this up a little bit. I'll call that imports. And we'll import the components module. And then make sure this gets added in here. And so instead of passing in declarations, I'm passing in imports. I think that looks good. We'll give it a test real quick. Yeah, and there we go. All right, so we still got the button. Okay, so now we see that our button is mounting. It looks great. It looks like how we do it. Let's start testing some functionality around it. So one thing that our button has a feature of is that it can, we'll come over here and look at the code. It has the option, you can pass in a focus input to make it so that when the button displays that it's going to actually have focus or not. This is for various reasons within the app itself, but let's go ahead and test to make sure that this functionality is working. So back in my test, I'll paste in a couple of new tests. So we have should not be focused when focus is falsy. And you can see that we have at button and we're not passing in focus. So focus is going to be undefined. So it's going to be falsy. And then I have, the text, and then I'm using the sci.focus command. And this is kind of what this does is that this will get you back any element that currently has focus. And since nothing is focused, it should not exist. And so we're verifying that it doesn't exist. Now in the second test, we're passing in focus is true, or a truthy value. And then we're saying like, hey, the button should be focused. So get me that element. And we're just verifying that it's actually our button that's focused by checking to make sure that the text is click me. And there you go. We got the two passing tests there. Another thing that we'll probably want to make sure that our buttons could do is respond to click events. And so in our button, we have an event emitter that when it's clicked, that this event emitter will get called. And I'll show you how we do that real quick. So we got a text should respond to a click event. We're mounting the component. We're making sure that when the click event is called, that our on-click event emitter gets called. And then the way that we pass this in is the second option here, the configuration, has a property called component properties. And this is where you can pass in any additional inputs or any outputs for that particular Angular component. And these will get bound to that component. And what we're doing here is we're creating a click event using this little helper function that we have here called create output spy. And this is going to create a Cypress spy that will let us listen into the event to make sure that it's getting called. And so we'll get the button, and then we'll use the Cypress click command to actually give it a user event click. And then we will get that SPI that we created right here on line 42, and we'll be like, hey, you should have been called. And this is going to verify that it was actually called. And we'll come over here, and we're going to see that it works. Sometimes when I'm writing tests, I like to make sure sometimes that they don't work as well. And so I'll go ahead and just uncomment out this click and just make sure I don't have a false positive. You can see here that it's waiting. This is Cypress will automatically do some waiting for you just in case it takes a little bit of time for that click event to come through. But it timed out after 4 seconds, and it's like, hey, you said it was going to be called. It never was called, so we failed your test. And go ahead and put that back in, and the tests now pass again. You can see every time I save the spec file, the test automatically rerun, and sometimes it's so fast that it's usually done before I actually pull back open the browser. All right, Jordan, got any other comments on this particular component, or should we hop on to maybe a little bit more advanced example?
Yeah, we could do a more advanced example. I think while you're switching, I'll mention a couple of people were asking about asking if you could use the class syntax to basically mount, so that way you don't have to also declare it like the way you did in your custom mount. And yes, you can. I think that if you scroll up to the very top example of your test here, here's example of button component. And when you mount using this syntax where you actually pass it the class under the covers of mount, we basically take that, add it to the declarations array for you. If you're using Angular 13 or a non-standalone app, and if you're using a standalone app, the only difference is that it works the exact same way, except for any standalone component would just have to be added to your imports array instead of the declarations array. And we do that same sort of mapping for you under the covers of mount too. So if you don't like the template syntax, I know it's Eli's favorite, the template syntax. But some people like the class syntax as well. So either way you like to do it, it works. Just note that when you pass it a string, the mount doesn't know what you're passing. It doesn't know the class or how to pass it to the Angular compiler. So yeah. I think we can go on to the more example. Oh, Eli just crashed there. His internet just died. Let's see. Maybe you can answer some questions here. I think
that sounds like a great call.
Example.
I swear we have had every internet issue, I think, today. So we have some really good questions in the Q&A. So if you don't mind going through a couple of those, Jordan, you can sort them by people who have upvoted them the most. There's a couple on there with like 4, 5, 6 upvotes. If you wanna start there, if you mind.
Okay, sure. Okay. So looks like Stephanie says we experienced several flaky issues when running end-to-end on our Angular app. Things like can't find an element, even though we can see it's there due to some layers on top, or not visible in the element in the window should be visible, or scroll into view don't seem to be doing the trick, and we end up using delay. It's hard to know without seeing your code specifically why those aren't working. Yeah, and it's hard to give a guidance without like seeing the code. It should be working. If it's not working, it doesn't have anything to do with like Angular specifically. Maybe just due to the nuances of the way your applications work. Sometimes something you can do with Angular is like sometimes if there's something that's hiding an element on the DOM, you can use the force of true flag inside of like click or something like that to say, I know it's not like visible on the DOM, but I know it's there and I want you to click it anyways. You can use something like that. But yeah, other than that, Stephanie, I feel like that's not a good answer to your question, but I'm sure if you reach out to us on Discord or Twitter or something after this, we'd be happy to maybe look into more specific reasons why it's maybe not working. Steven asks, is there a way to structure your tests in such a way to use JSON fixtures for local testing and then reuse the same test to test the same user journey on dev or QA server? So yeah, so Cypress has this notion of something called SIDA intercept, and basically what it does, and Eli was just getting ready to demo that, but the idea of that is, let me pull up an example. I think this will probably be the best way to explain it. And I apologize, but I was not planning on demoing. Let's see. Let me share my screen. And go here. Can you guys see my screen? I think so.
Yes.
Like GitHub. Okay.
Good.
So here, here's this repo has some examples, and here's an Angular app, and here's an Angular standalone app. So if we go to Angular, and if we go to this app component, app.side.ts, there's an example of intercept here, and the idea is with component testing in particular, you don't you want to think of it like a unit test in the sense of you don't want it to rely upon third party like things or other systems. Like with an end-to-end test, a true pure end-to-end test, you're doing like you're relying on all of it because you want to make sure all the parts work together. You want to make sure the database call works, the API works, the front end receives the API request, handles errors, all that kind of stuff. But with component testing, you don't want to worry about that. You just want to know that you just want the component to test that like in isolation. And so what we recommend is using SIDA intercept for those cases. So in this case, this app component makes an HTTP request to the auth endpoint. And we can then specify that in this example, when we get a 200, basically the user is authenticated. We want to pass a 200, meaning success. And then the message that gets back is that, hey, you've been authenticated. And then in the other cases here, and so this right here is a body. You can manually inline these, or you can use your fixtures folder, like the Cypress fixtures folder, to reference this fixture. And so you could basically have a login success.json fixture, and you could have a login failed .json fixture. And so in those cases, yeah, here's another example. Same thing. It's a post request to auth and getting a status code of 401. And we're just mentioning the bad username or password. We click a button to log in, and then basically we display that error from the API response back into the app. So that's an example of why you would want to use intercept for component testing. It's something a lot of people have used for end-to-end testing, but not something. But it's like something you would definitely use a lot in component testing. So, Eli, you're back. Maybe.
Yeah, hopefully.
Do you want to finish up your little app, or should we keep taking questions?
Yeah, I think that might have ate into the time that we had
Yeah.
to demo that last one. And I'm just hoping I didn't get like stuck in some really uncompromising
No,
like
it was like looking to the side, and I was thinking, I think Eli's really perplexed on something, or no, he's frozen. So,
Yeah.
So Brent has a really good question. I see. He said, "Can we pass input items using the class syntax?" So yes. Can you share that? Like, do you have that screen up, Eli?
Yeah. Hold on a second.
Be most beneficial to show it.
Or are you looking at my code? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So back over here, and so question was with the class syntax
Yep.
like this, right? Yeah. So
Yep.
basically, it's the same exact way. Okay, maybe not the same exact way, but you use the component properties here to pass in those, right?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, so in this particular case, the button component has that focus that we saw earlier, so we can pass that in, and say it's true. You can tell here when we are using or passing in a component, we get really good IntelliSense that's showing us like all the stuff that's available on our component that we can pass in and stuff. We don't currently get that with the template syntax because we don't know offhand right now of what the component is. We'll hopefully be able to get that in the future. But for right now, like, yeah, if you're passing in the component, get some pretty good IntelliSense on it.
Perfect. Steven has another question. He asks if you're using something like NX, would you create a separate project for your set of end-to-end tests and your component tests? It's a good question. So for those of you who are familiar or not familiar with NX, it's a build tool, but it's used in a lot of cases like monorepos. And when you generate like a new application, it by default creates a matching Cypress application that is kind of like connected to your application. So that's why they're saying there's like a separate application. No, the way component testing with NX works is that we basically install Cypress into the original application because we want the component test to co-locate next to the components. So you would have your end-to-end Cypress app, and then you would have your original app that would have Cypress installed as well. So then you'd have technically like a Cypress install on both, but both of them are used for very different scenarios. And then your end-to-end app would just be configured for end-to-end, and your regular app Cypress would just be configured for component testing. Let's see.
Have you started diving into the Q&As yet?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at now. So if you point out any there, how much or how little end-to-end testing is enough? Are there any metrics or references you can use? I wouldn't say. I mean, you want to speak to code coverage a little bit, Eli? Maybe that's a good place to drop this.
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to the answer is going to be it depends on the needs of your team, the needs of your organization. If you're shooting for a certain amount of code coverage, and basically you want to be able to get your test suite up to a point that you feel reliable in being able to ship your app when the test suite passes. And so a lot of the stuff that you're doing in end-to-end testing, you might actually find better like converting that over to component tests. So like, especially if you're testing, like if you found yourself having to write end-to-end tests to get to a particular component to test that component in a page, like you can probably take like all those tests, put them into a component test and still get the same amount of code coverage and everything else. But you'll get the advantages of component testing being that you don't have to like spin up an entire like environment, and you can like mock things a lot easier and all that fun stuff. But component testing doesn't replace end-to-end testing. In fact, like end-to-end testing actually gives you more bang for the buck when it comes to code coverage, just because when you visit a page, you are hitting so many lines of code in your application to get there. And so if you're trying to reach a certain amount of code coverage, then you're still going to want to like make sure that you're doing end-to-end testing, but you might scale it back a little bit. You might do like the most critical pass to your application or whatnot through end-to-end testing, and then do more like edge cases or UI tests and stuff like that instead of component testing.
Perfect. Tyler asks, is component testing meant to replace Storybook, and what are the advantages here compared to Storybook? A couple things. It's not meant to necessarily replace Storybook. I think a couple things to note are with, Storybook has kind of fundamentally a different approach where, Cypress is a testing tool. And so, though you do get the same sort of Storybook like snapshots of this is what your component looks like in different like different states. Cypress does give you that as well, but the main advantage, in my opinion, is you also get to use, you still run assertions and test and validate that those individual parts work as well. And it's really great for, like if you had a reusable component library or something like that, like you're trying to make a design system, like it's great that it looks right, but like you want to be able to validate and test that like certain scenarios work, like when you actually ship it and it gets consumed by third party things, right? So one of the main advantages is you can, write assertions. I know you can do that with Storybook. It's some ways. I think the main advantage with Cypress is that if you're already familiar with Cypress, you're already writing end-to-end tests. The API is exact same. There's nothing different other than we added a mount command to mount your component, but you're using the same API, you're in the same test runner, the same tools. So you kind of get all the things that you kind of love about end-to-end testing, you just add it to component testing. Let's see, you got any more questions, Eli?
Yeah, let me know. I don't know if you're marking these off as you answer them, but there's
Yeah,
one
I
question
am.
here about is Cypress component testing similar to Angular testing library? And Angular testing library and kind of like React testing library are probably the best equivalents to what we have for component testing outside of Cypress. And so they kind of both fill the same niche of component testing for your applications. Kind of some of the advantages that we think Cypress brings you is that we actually render your components in a real browser versus JS DOM, which those do by default out of the box. And so with that, you get to actually see what your component looks like. And so a lot of times your test or your component consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And when you're just looking at the JavaScript and HTML, you're not actually too sure if your component is rendering properly and displaying properly. And with Cypress, you get that. Plus, you can use the test runner to play and interact with your component while you're actually developing it, where in those other tools, you'd have to plop it on a page somewhere and do that for your type of development. So those are definitely great testing tools as well. But those are some of the things that we think Cypress has an advantage on for them.
Sure. It looks like we may have time for one or two more. David asks, how does component testing in Cypress with Angular differ from component testing in Cypress with React or other front-end frameworks? Are there any nuances to consider across front-end frameworks? There's a couple things I can think of, and maybe Eli, you have some other ones you want to point out. But one of the main differences, or I would say, first of all, we built component testing very intentional in the mind, like we wanted it to feel, we wanted to kind of thread the needle in the sense of we wanted it to feel Cypressy. We wanted it to be kind of as consistent as possible from one framework to the next, but we also didn't want to force like an ergonomic opinion or something that would like feel unangular in Angular or vice versa with other frameworks. So in a lot of ways, they're almost completely identical, but there are a few nuances. One being with, like, for example, Angular, the config is different that you pass it. And one of the big differences there is, for example, like with a Vue or React or something, like you can pass it styles to like, display like in your component or something like that. Where as Angular, we actually just source all that information from like your project config or like your angular.json file. So that way you don't have to pass it like any of your assets, your images, your styles, anything like that. Like we actually build your dev server, when you launch Cypress, it does all that for you. So like you don't have to worry about any of those things. We also have the auto output spy flag on output. So in Angular, the notion of an output, which is similar with a lot of other functions, like our other frameworks like React, you use like a callback function, but there's no way to really like differentiate that it from something else with Angular, because it's all TypeScript, we can basically make certain assumptions. So with like if this button component, yeah, you do something like Eli's showing you, like in React, you would do that. And then with Angular, because outputs are event emitters as a type, if you pass us the auto output spy flag in your project config, then it will by default go through your component that you pass it and look for all the event emitter properties and automatically create a spy for that. So if your output property name was clicked, right, then you wouldn't have to pass a component property or a spy or anything like that. It would automatically just create a spy on the event emitter, and you would just reference the alias like clicked spy. So it just basically appends spy at the end of it. So cool. I think we are at time, Emily. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but
no, but that's because really good questions kind of coming in at the end. Thank you both, Jordan and Eli, for doing a great job, not only on getting through every internet issue we could possibly have, but also showing a great demo, great content, answering some of the great questions. Just to kind of wrap a couple pieces up, since we're at time, this has, again, recorded. This will all be shared out. We'll kind of go through the questions, and we can share them kind of amongst our team and see if there's some questions that we want to be able to share out, either like in the event description on the YouTube page, or just to kind of make sure that we cover all of that. But before we close out, Eli, Jordan, is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything else that you'd like to make sure people know about?
Just want to thank everybody for coming today, and do want to say, like, hey, if you're not a member of our Discord community, come and join us over on our Discord and pop some of these questions over there as well. We'll be happy
we have an
to
Angular channel.
Yeah, we'll be happy to jump in there and continue this conversation. I don't have a link to the Discord channel in the slides, but do you have it offhand?
You know what, Eli, we are on the same page, because I already posted it in that, and then I pinned it up at the top, so you could go right there, join our Discord. We would love to have you there, like an Angular channel. It's a great way to ask these questions, and then that way you can also tap into the knowledge of the entire Cypress community, truly the best community out there. I'm not biased at all, so that they can get in there and help make sure you get your questions answered too.
Absolutely. And just want to like end this saying, like, hey, go out there and give our stuff for Angular developers a try. Let us know what you think. Give component testing a try. Send us your feedback. Right now, we currently are in beta with component testing. That is looking to go GA fairly soonish. But yeah, if you have any feedback, please get in touch. Let us know.
Yeah, and come say hi to us at NGConf next week if any of you guys would be there. So.
All right, see ya. We'll go ahead and end this now, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.